The current state of affairs don't need an introduction. You guys already know what's going on. What I want to talk about more specifically is Russia's relationship with Rainbow Six, and why they were ever even considered an important part of the canon in the first place. It might seem like I'm overly fixated on Russia for the purpose of this video, but I promise it'll make sense by the end. If you look at Russia's relationship with the West now, it might seem a bit strange that Russia is even involved in Rainbow to begin with.
Wait, I'm Russian, so I'm supposed to know something about it.
Most people can surmise that Russia and NATO utilize their militaries independently and have done so for a long time. The very fact that Russian operators exclusively used their own optics for a period of time was a sort of tactical touch that made sense from a thematic standpoint because, well, Russian guns aren't configured to use NATO optics, and it made sense to domestically produce them. With a macro lens, you can figure out who's getting support from who over the course of the 20th and 21st century based off of the guns they have. NATO's standardized ammunition types following World War II include just about everybody west of the Berlin Wall. That's your typical 5.56, 7.62 NATO, 9mm Parabellum, where countries in the USSR had their own Soviet ammunition measurements. 5.45, 7.62 Soviet, 9mm Makarov. Good guys had ARs, bad guys had AKs. At least, that was the framework I grew up with in the States. Obviously, the world's more complicated than that, and there's probably some poetic irony in the folk story of the Ghost of Kiev, going toe-to-toe with modern Russian fighter jets in a relic of the Cold War that was designed to represent the pinnacle of Soviet air power in the 80s. Now the main fighter jet of a country fighting to keep itself from being reintegrated into a new idea of the USSR. Soviet equipment versus Russian and Soviet equipment in Europe represents a point most people never thought possible. On a side note, even Israel, despite the considerable backing it got from Western countries, saw its soldiers arming themselves with AK-47s they captured during the Six-Day War, which would be the bedrock for the development of the Balashnikov and eventually the Galil, a Kalashnikov pattern gun that fired NATO rounds, along with the ability to tactically open a nice, cold bottle of Fizzy Baba. Now, stuff like this gets written off as gun nerd trivia, but I think it's worth mentioning because they draw lines to the way NATO and the Warsaw Pact operated and how it bleeds into now. To this day, Russia carries over nuances like this to things besides their military. Russian planes have attitude indicators that fix the horizon to a flat angle, making the bank and pitch angles of the plane move. Everywhere else, the reverse is true. The horizon moves instead. The plane stays fixed. Russian trains run on a wider gauge than American or European trains. NATO tracer rounds light up red. Soviet tracer rounds light up green. In fact, that's the same reason the evil Empire from Star Wars fires green lasers and the scrappy rebels fire red ones. The dynamic between NATO and the USSR had vast cultural implications that shaped the events of the world as we know it. I'm not here to condemn Tom Clancy for being a conservative. Lord knows Ubisoft is not in an enviable position, already having a hell of a time trying to wrestle with the Tom Clancy license. I grew up watching and enjoying the Jack Ryan films like Hunt for Red October, and everybody loves the Splinter Cell games. But the idea that Siege in current year is not a political game is ridiculous, and comes off like somebody sticking their fingers in their ear and going, la 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 la, I can't hear you, no politics to me. Famous Ronald Reagan lover Thomas Leo Clancy Jr. did not hide his political leanings. He claimed the, quote, general differences between conservatives and liberals is that liberals like pretty pictures, and conservatives like to build bridges that people can drive across. Remember when I said, quote, that means they actually said that. Furthermore, he blamed liberals for 9/11, citing the reason as their supposed gutting of the CIA. So yeah, this guy had strong opinions. Tom Clancy's first notable book and the first Jack Ryan story, The Hunt for Red October, was his big break and was probably published by the Naval Institute Press on the virtue of it being an exciting, action-packed, seafaring adventure about crafty and daring naval commanders at the height of the Cold War, and the intelligence community of the US probably saw an opportunity there to do a little bit of cultural diplomacy. After all, the rogue Soviet captain, played by Sean Connery in the movie, is a defector, and his fatally wounded subordinate officer tragically laments, "I would like to have seen Montana," toward the story's end. The idea of disgruntled Soviets wanting to rid themselves of the ideological baggage associated with their national allegiance was a gripping one, because the idea of a Soviet defector was not purely fiction. A Russian pilot of the widely feared MiG-25 Foxbat managed to sneak away to Japan and give the West crucial insight to the engineering of one of the world's fastest planes. The Latvian Mikhail Baryshnikov infuriated the Soviet Union when he defected to the States to dance with the New York City Ballet and eventually do a recording of Tchaikovsky's famous The Nutcracker, a figure and piece that were considered cornerstones of Russian cultural output and, of course, a projection of their soft power. Also, they covered up the fact that Tchaikovsky was gay, because, you know. Now, if you're wondering what the hell any of this has to do with Rainbow Six Siege, nobody would blame you. But I think it's important to understand the circumstances around how Tom Clancy got popular in the first place. His writing career started during the height of the Cold War, and continued on through the USSR's collapse. Although he isn't around anymore to see the Cold War II Electric Avenue. Ultimately, getting along with the Russians after the collapse of the Soviet Union was seen as the best case scenario by a lot of people, maybe not out of love and affection, more so out of practicality, since we knew what they were capable of militarily, and it certainly would be more beneficial to have them as an ally rather than as an enemy. I've dubbed this the Russian who is a bad guy but not bad guy trope, a very sophisticated term, I know. In the Jack Affleck movie, Sum of All Fears, yes, I know it's weird to think of Ben Affleck being in a Tom Clancy movie. The president of the brand spanking new Russian Federation, played by Kieran Hines. Did I say that right? His character of the Russian president is depicted as a reformer who merely adopted the popular Russian strongman persona to get support from the military. The nuke that goes off in Baltimore isn't a Russian one. Russia was framed. The bomb was planted by somebody trying to get the US and Russia into a nuclear war. Like they always do in the movies, they get the bad guy, but America and Russia become best don't start nuclear war buddies. Isn't that nice? In Battlefield 3, the Russians get framed again when the big bad steals a bunch of nukes from Russia, and a Russian agent pleads with the main character to help him stop their detonation. The famous character Makarov from Modern Warfare basically sets up a World War III as the helmsman of an authoritarian Russian ultra-nationalist group who is opposed to the post-1991 Russian government on the claim that not wanting to blow up the world is some bitch shit. Modern Warfare's depiction of the Russian democratic process is significantly more bleak than others, alluding to the idea that the ultra-nationalists were widely supported in elections. The first act of the first Modern Warfare game ends when the fictional president of Saudi Arabia is executed by a revolutionary warlord, Khaled al-Assad, who is, of course, buddies with some of the leaders of this Russian ultra-nationalist movement. And the executed president is of course maligned for colluding with the West, or at least allegedly colluding with the West. So yeah, definitely some themes and patterns in these games. Anything that involves Western militaries, when we try to write military fiction, we usually have some kind of allusion to the Russians, because that's just how Russia occupied the cultural conscience. However, if anything, Siege's depiction is a bit more optimistic, if you want to call it that, because it portrays lots of different people from different walks of life and sorts of professional experiences in the world of tactics and security. The idea that NATO and a new Russia could get along on security issues was highly sought after. And in some cases, it actually did happen, not just in video games or movies. You won't see a lot of Wikipedia articles dedicated to these instances, though. At one point, Russia agreed to let NATO travel across Russian territory to transport weapons and personnel to the northern region of Afghanistan. It started during Obama's first term and then kind of went away by the end of his second term, because, well, remember when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time? Rainbow Six, the original book, came out in 1998, well after the Russian Federation had established itself as the premier Russian government. And to combat global terrorist threats, it would only seem logical to leverage the knowledge and assistance of the Russians. Even if there were things they did that we found off-putting, and in the worst-case scenario, it was at least an allusion to the idea that NATO and Russia could collaborate on problems that affected the globe after they more or less cleaned up, I guess is the way that you could put it. What's happened in the past few decades is nothing short of a tragedy. Most Russian people find the invasion of Ukraine deplorable and are caught in a vice grip, since action can't really be taken against Russia without putting nukes on the table. At the very least, Rainbow Six was different for saying, hey, we take these countries as they are, and we put them on the same team to solve problems that affect the globe. Rainbow is obviously a fictional organization, but as Harry would probably put it, it's the idea that's important. Rainbow 100% represents a pragmatic but altruistic idea that even a country like Russia can be, at the very least, diplomatic enough to send representatives to Rainbow. It might seem far-fetched, but the idea of it does sound good to me. So in light of the current state of affairs, I do hope better days are to come. I hope the Russian people can get a government that's more representative of how they really feel someday. I don't know if UB plans on adding a Ukrainian operator next year. Maybe it's not a bad idea.